Episode 8. There is a way. I'm telling you, Rabineau said. He's losing his marbles. Rabineau was walking alongside the buggy, enjoying the bright and cool morning as he chatted with Eris, who lounged lazily in the back of the buggy, which Gareth was currently driving, silent and stalwart as ever. Today, the trio were making the long and exceedingly boring journey to Linram's special grove of pine trees. The goal of today's visit is not to find the tree that will provide you with the wood you will use to make a staff of your own, your first magical artifact, Linram had told him earlier that morning before they had departed from the chateau. But instead, it is to get a feel for how manipulated pines are different from their naturally growing brethren. Besides being manipulated? Rabineau had asked dryly, and had received a smack upside his head for it. Precisely! Now, several hours into their slow, plodding journey, Rabineau was recalling his training in the woods to Eris, who was desperately endeavoring to pretend to care. He told me to stay in the woods until I heard the lamenting of the stone, whatever that means. Rabineau was moody, grouchy from being unable to make any progress in his new training, or even to make any sense of it. He wasn't speaking in riddles, boy, Eris said, cracking an eyelid to observe Rabineau before yawning animatedly. He wants you to listen to the forest. I have been listening to the damn forest, Rabineau complained. Every day for the past 2 weeks, I have been going into that forest, sitting on the boulder, and listening to the forest until my ass goes numb. I am now acutely aware of what a fly sounds like as it comes buzzing through the trees to land on me. Repeatedly. See, Eris stretched languidly. That's where you are misinterpreting the instructions. How in the hells am I misinterpreting the instructions? Rabineau snapped. Sure, you're listening to the forest, but you aren't actually hearing anything. Rabineau looked over at Eris with a scowl. You gonna lose your marbles too? Eris hissed softly before she continued, indignant. Don't be a dolt, boy. It's like staring into space, being lost in thought. Yes, your eyes are open and looking forward, but you are not registering anything that happens before your eyes because you are distracted. In your particular case, you haven't truly listened yet, so you don't know what it feels like. Now you're speaking in riddles. Eris sighed deeply. I must remember to ask Lynn why he insisted on taking on an apprentice again. She looked over at Rabineau with clear disdain. Human senses are garbage, Rabbit. That's the first thing you must internalize. Rabineau frowned. I don't follow. No, of course you don't, Eris said dryly. Let's start with your eyes. Perhaps some of the worst eyes found in nature. No night vision, very little capacity to perceive details at a distance. Compared with a creature like myself or a raptor, you're practically blind. It was Rabineau's turn to sigh. I assume you'll be getting to the point eventually here? So impatient, Eris sniffed. You must work on that. I'll add it to the list, Rabineau shot back, right after hearing the lamenting of the stone. Eris rolled her eyes and continued. Since blunt force seems to be necessary to get anything into that thick skull of yours, I'll get right to the point and speak as simply as possible. Your hearing is terrible. You have the capacity to hear much better than you do, but your kind has never seemed to have a need for it. Certain people, like Lynn, have pushed the bounds on their own, but that's precisely because he is a will mage. I thought you said you were getting right to the point, Rabineau said flatly. Eris snarled. Hells, you are irritating, boy. Thank you. Eris took a deep breath. What your master is trying to teach you is the ability to hear will. Rabineau frowned again. Okay, seriously, are you just fucking with me? Eris moved in a blur, only seeming to slightly shift her weight, but Rabineau instantly felt the burn of fresh cuts across his arm nearest the buggy. She had sliced him from just above the elbow all the way down to the wrist. I have warned you, boy, Eris said dangerously, about how you speak to the eternal cat. Rabineau sucked in air and swore under his breath, examining the cut as it began to bleed. It wasn't deep enough to require attention, just enough to be incredibly painful and irritating. Eris was an expert at inflicting pain on Rabineau. Noted, Rabineau said. My apologies. Eris stuck her nose up in the air disdainfully. Your apology is not accepted. She licked her claws daintily. But you're on the right track. Rabineau sighed once more. I'm deeply sorry for insulting your superior knowledge, Eris. Please, oh please, will you share your intellect with me? That's better, she said. Fine. Where was I? Something about hearing will? Rabineau answered. Ah, yes, Eris agreed. Your ability to hear will. You see, the world is full of far more noise than you are able to comprehend, all of it being the sound of will. Everything, from the birds to the trees to the dirt we tread on, every single thing exudes will. It may not be measurable or comparable to the quantities of will you wield while casting, but it is there nonetheless. Lynn is trying to get you to open your ears and your mind to the sounds of nature. Once you do that, you will be capable of far more than simply hearing the lamenting of the stone. Wait a minute, Rabineau asked, frowning. So you mean that's an actual thing? The lamenting of the stone? Of course it is, Eris answered. Lynn cut the poor thing in half. Wouldn't you lament? But, Rabineau said, it's just a boulder. So, Eris replied, the boulder may not feel pain like you would if your arm were lopped off, but it still very much feels the loss of its other half. But, Rabineau spluttered, how? What in the hells do you mean? Eris asked. What was once whole is no longer. That in and of itself is cause for lamentation. How does a boulder lament? Eris narrowed her eyes. This conversation seems to be going nowhere productive. Needless to say, Rabbit, if you were to take your training seriously and master the techniques Lynn is attempting to pound into your thick skull, you would be able to open your mind, and these questions would be answered. Rabineau shook his head sadly. I just wish Lynn would be more straightforward with his instructions. Eris scoffed. His instructions were crystal clear, she told him haughtily. And that's master to you. Show some deference, you imbecile. Rabineau rolled his eyes and opened his mouth to reply, but Gareth raised a hand from the driver's seat of the buggy and spoke. We near the grove, was all he said. Yes, Eris purred. Thank you, Gareth. The forest had been sparse and patchy for the last several miles, yet as they neared the pine grove, the foliage around them got increasingly thick and more lush. The plant life grew so robust that it even began encroaching on the narrow road, and the patches of sunlight that had been filtering through the treetops gave way to shadow as those gaps were filled. One could say that this area was utterly choked with plant life. In fact, the plants grew so fervently that just up ahead, the road was completely blocked by vines, branches, trunks, and leaves. Rabineau couldn't even see through the mass of plant life that formed a wall before them. Gareth brought the buggy to a halt a few yards from the blockage. "We have arrived," was all he said. Eris yawned and stretched in the back of the buggy before she got to her feet, and in 2 quick leaps, she jumped to the railing, then straight onto Rabineau's shoulders. She perched there like a parrot, tail curling around Rabineau's neck. "All right," she said, sounding as bored as ever. "Shall we go in then?" "What?" Rabineau asked. "You mean through that?" He motioned towards the plants. "How do you figure?" "Oh, that's just an illusion," Eris said confidently. "You can walk right through it." "Really?" Rabineau asked, amazement creeping into his voice. "Oh yes, really," she purred. "Why don't you give it a try?" Rabineau strode forward until he was within reach of the foliage blocking the way. Then he stopped, reaching out tentatively to touch the tips of the leaves. When his fingers actually made contact with the leaves, he frowned and turned his head towards Eris, who couldn't receive the full force of his doubtful expression, though she knew it was there. "Don't worry about that," she said with a mischievous tone. "The illusion has to be top-notch to keep any unwanted attention off of Lynn's precious pines. If you just push through the leaves, you'll emerge on the other side." Rabineau sighed warily, putting his arms up before his face and taking a breath, preparing to push through. His nerves got the best of him, and he pushed harder than he should have, so that when the leaves gave way to fallen timber, he was unable to stop himself. And because his arms were up in front of his face, he didn't even really see it coming. In seconds, Rabineau was sprawled on the ground, shins screaming and forearms complaining from the impact, and then the subsequent rebounding. A soft chuckle came from the path behind Rabineau, where Eris had leapt from his shoulder and stood back to watch his blunder. "Oh," she said with deep satisfaction, "I should mention that the actual illusion is just over there." She dipped her head, indicating a place in the wall of foliage just off of the path. Rabineau groaned. "If you knew that all along," he said irritably, "then why did you just let me charge into those trunks?" Eris lithely closed the distance between them in the blink of an eye, leaning over Rabineau's head and looking him straight in the eye. "I told you to have respect for the eternal cat, Rabbit. I hope that was sufficient reminder for now." She started walking away, purring softly, tail held high and haughty. "Besides, it was funny as hell." Rabineau got to his feet, scowling, and brushed himself off, checking to see if the damage was any worse than just bumps and scrapes. It wasn't. Grumbling over Eris's antics, he followed her over to the place she had indicated. This time, Rabineau let Eris go first. She stalked through the trees, vanishing into the thicket as if it wasn't even there. Taking a deep breath, Rabineau followed. Though he could not see through the illusion, the moment he was past the threshold, the way forward became clear. A short tunnel was formed through the solid wall of plant life, leading to a shining porthole of light at the end. Covering the short distance quickly, Rabineau emerged from the tunnel to a dazzling degree of sunlight after the muted darkness of the forest he had just left. Holding a hand to shade his eyes and letting them adjust, with every passing second, Rabineau was filled with more awe. Where he had emerged marked the boundary line of the pine grove. It was a stark line, as if an invisible wall stood guard over this precisely enclosed area. The bright, clear blue sky shone brilliantly down upon the rows and rows of pine trees that neatly filled the enclosed space. Rabineau's jaw dropped open when he saw them. What had to have been hundreds of trees, and not a single one of them grew straight up and down. Every tree had some sort of shape or design to its growth pattern. Rabineau saw trees that spiraled like springs, some that bent and twisted like a snake, still others that were swirling in on themselves. He even saw what must have been the design that spawned the hellish wheels Rabineau had practiced sustained will magic on. The tree grew comically round, with a perfectly circular hole in the trunk and branches growing in towards the middle like spokes. "Wow," was all Rabineau could muster through his awe. "Right?" Eris asked snidely as she leapt back onto Rabineau's shoulders. "I always knew he was eccentric, but this is downright insanity." "How do you figure?" Rabineau asked, still unable to tear his gaze from the trees. "Who else would do such a depraved thing to these poor pines?" "Depraved?" Rabineau scoffed. "All the trees I can see look incredibly healthy, despite the odd angles that some of them have taken." "He did this for fun," Eris continued. "I doubt he had any feasible use in mind for half of these designs. He simply did it because he could, and it was fun to him." Rabineau quirked his head. "But all he did was direct their growth. It's not like he tortured the trees or anything." "Do you think the trees enjoy being twisted about?" "Well," Rabineau sputtered, "I mean, they look healthy." "Boys," Eris sighed deeply, "this is where your current training would come into play. If you were more in tune with nature and the will weaved all around us, you would be able to perceive their pain." Rabineau raised an eyebrow. "I've seen trees twisted all on their own, clinging to the sides of cliffs. I do not believe that these trees are in pain, Eris. If trees can even feel pain." She narrowed her eyes. "All right then, Mr. Know-it-all." She walked past him lightly, leading deeper into the grove. "Follow me. Perhaps you need my assistance after all." The pair walked past dozens of intricately shaped trees until they made their way to roughly the middle, where several stumps sat clustered together. Eris leapt lightly into one and sat facing Rabineau. "Take a seat," she instructed. Rabineau did as he was told, sitting on the stump across from Eris. "Now," she said, "show me how you meditate." Rabineau blinked, taken aback by the instruction. But he did as he was told, pulling up his legs and folding them neatly beneath himself, and placing his hands limply in his lap. Sitting up straight, he closed his eyes. He sat there for several long and uncomfortable moments of utter silence, unsure of whether or not Eris was playing a joke on him. He cracked an eye to peer at her. "What?" Eris said, head cocked to the side inquisitively. "Is that it?" Rabineau said. "What do you mean?" "Is that all you do?" she went on. "You just sit there with your eyes shut? That's not meditating. That's attempting to fall asleep." Rabineau opened both eyes to glare at her. "That's not all I do." "Oh, yeah?" Eris purred. "What else, then?" Rabineau sputtered. "Listen really hard and, stuff." "At your rate, you'll be a regular yogi in no time," Eris said dryly. Rabineau sagged. "Are you going to help me or sit there criticizing me for the rest of the day?" "Still deciding," she replied. Rabineau made to get up. "Fine, then I'll go—" "Sit down," came the command from Eris. There was no room for argument in her tone. Rabineau settled back down, simply sitting and drinking. Rabineau settled back down. "Simply sitting and drinking in your surroundings will not be enough to heighten your awareness." She leapt lightly from the stump she was sitting on and began pacing before Rabineau. "For the layman, sure, that might achieve what they are attempting to attain, but for you, that simply will not do." She stopped pacing directly in front of him and sat, looking up at him. "Have you ever heard of the monks of Dalmoon?" Rabineau shook his head. "They are a group that has been practicing and mastering breathing techniques for centuries. Breathing techniques? Rabineau asked. Oh, yes, Eris answered. Techniques that have allowed a normal human being to attain a near catatonic state for a sustained period of time. We're talking about weeks, Rabbit. Rabineau guffawed, but Eris powered on. It may sound preposterous to you, but it is true. By mastering certain breathing patterns while they meditate, they can become far more in tune with every cell in their body, giving them the ability to slow everything down to a near standstill. The practice of going catatonic for that long is frowned upon, seeing as it can be very hard on your body, but still, it is possible and has been done. So you're saying I need to practice breathing techniques? Rabineau asked. You're getting ahead of me, Rabbit, Eris sniffed appreciatively. But essentially, yes. By focusing on your breathing, you will become more in tune with yourself. And by knowing yourself, will casting becomes far easier, Rabineau finished her words that had come from Linrem's lips more times than Rabineau could count. Precisely, Eris said, pleased. And once you get to know yourself, the rest of the world begins to gain clarity. And then I'll be able to hear the stone or whatever? Rabineau asked. Eris sighed, her demeanor quickly sliding to irritated. Yes, Rabbit, then you'll be able to hear the stone or whatever. Impossible child. So, Rabineau asked, how do I focus on my breathing? Eris sighed. Why don't you try paying attention to it like you paid attention to the fly buzzing through the forest to land on you? Rabineau frowned. That fly was a demon spawn, I swear. Demon spawn or not, Eris continued, you honed in on it, focused on it. You need to do the same with your breathing. Focus on every breath. Hone in on every molecule your lungs absorb. Oof, Rabineau groaned. That sounds difficult. Nothing worth having in this life ever comes at an easy price, Rabbit, Eris pontificated. It would be best to internalize that. Now focus. Fine, Rabineau said begrudgingly. He drew his legs up and folded them beneath himself again. He then lay his hands lightly on his thighs, relaxing the muscles in his arms. Sitting up straight, he closed his eyes and began focusing on his breathing. At first, the exercise seemed mundane, boring even. Rabineau took note of the lengths of his breaths and began to make them more measured. Using his heartbeat as a metronome, he drew in breath for 4 beats, then exhaled for 4 beats. Controlling his breathing in such a way became nearly hypnotic for Rabineau. He ceased to feel the stiffness of the wood stump beneath his legs, stopped feeling the sun's rays bathing his skin and the light breeze tickling his scalp. All of his awareness had been turned inward, observing and maintaining the controlled and measured pace of his breathing. Soon, he could identify the precise sensation of the air he inhaled cooling his esophagus after the heated air he exhaled warmed it. The pendulous nature of the affair added to the deepening of Rabineau's meditative state. Soon, Rabineau was aware of how the air he inhaled filled every pocket of his lungs, and as he exhaled, he was aware of its vacancy. Once he reached this state in his meditation, he remembered and heeded Eris's words, focusing on the minute workings of his lungs. This, Rabineau discovered, was far more difficult than the work he had already done in focusing his breathing. He was able to reach a state of awareness in which he could feel his lungs filling and emptying, but when he attempted to focus on the smaller, more intricate structures, he lost sight of the whole. That simply would not do, he already knew. Eris would scoff and criticize his lack of capacity to be precise while focusing on the whole. Rabineau knew, somewhere in the back of his mind, that perhaps the fine motor control necessary to maintain this meditation and to take it further simply had yet to be honed within himself, not strong enough to accomplish what he was asking, yet. But then the stubbornness that Linrim both hated and adored screamed at him from the forefront. He would not simply give up because it became difficult. No matter how long he had to sit on this blasted stump and listen to its sorrowful cries while he was trying to focus on his breathing. Rabineau's eyes flew open. The effect was a little disorienting, seeing as he wasn't as keenly aware of the passage of time while he had meditated, and the sun had shifted several degrees since he had begun. Pushing aside the wave of vertigo, he looked down at the stump in amazement. He hadn't meant to, but somewhere along the line of his introspective endeavors, he had begun to sense the stump beneath his legs. He had been so wholeheartedly focused on being aware of himself that when his awareness had expanded ever so slightly, he had blocked out the newest sensations he was receiving as background noise. However, Rabineau was certain he had felt the stump beneath him in a way that he had never before. He had somehow managed to tap into the very essence of the thing and feel the fading pain and sorrow that still clung to the dying plant. "Well, well, well," Eris said from where she was curled on the stump across from him. "Once again, it would seem like we shall make a proper will mage of you yet."